Today we're going to be in the book of James. And in the end of James' letter, he is encouraging the Christians to talk to each other about their troubles, about their sins, and pray for one another. He says in verse 16 of chapter 5, "Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. Brethren, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, and someone turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his ways will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. We got a lot here to unpack, so let's break this down. And so here James is ending this letter with praying for each other, and he's reminding us of the power of prayer. But the power of prayer is only effective when the person is righteous, that they are praying fervent, effective prayers. And so he gives us an example here, kind of seemingly out of place, about Elijah and how he prayed for rain, because isn't he talking about praying for our spiritual well-being? So let's go on here and let's visit this passage in 1 Kings chapters 17 and 18 is where you can find the story where Elijah prays for a drought. Upon the commands of God, he prays for a drought, and for 3 years and 6 months, there's no rain. We learn a lot about this cool story where Elijah was fed by ravens by the brook, and then once the brook ran dry, he was sent to a widow and her son who were about to eat their last meal and just give up because there was no food, and they were going to eat this meal and die. And Elijah meets her and he says to make me some bread, and he stayed there and he's being sustained by God. After this, he goes to Ahab, close to the end of the 3 years and 6 months. He goes to Obadiah, actually, and he sends for Ahab. And so Ahab's been looking for him everywhere. And Obadiah is very nervous about this. But nonetheless, he goes and gets him. And Elijah tells Ahab to gather all of the prophets of Baal. This is one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament because this man, Elijah, was a mighty man of God. And this is going to be the big point of what we're talking about here in this passage, what James is reminding us. And so Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal, which were 450 in number. He says, we'll take 2 bulls. You take one, I'll take one. You pick first. And whichever one, we'll build an altar and we'll offer sacrifice. And whichever God burns up the sacrifice, we'll know that is the true God. And meanwhile, all of the children of Israel are there too. And he says to them, how long are you going to stand between 2 opinions? How long are you going to be on one side and the other side? If Baal is God, worship him. If the Lord is God, worship him. And the Bible tells us they answered him not a word. This people who are supposed to be God's chosen people would not tell them they serve God. Very sad situation here, and this is what we're getting at. See, Elijah's prayer wasn't the important part of the story, because Elijah did challenge these men. And as we know, when we read the story that goes on to say the prophets of Baal, they didn't do anything. Baal does not exist, and so Baal could not help them in this situation. And to the point where Elijah's taunting them. And then he not only is about to begin, but he not only does what the prophets do as far as praying to God, he digs a trench. He pours water onto this trench, a massive amount of water, and he does this 3 times. And then he prays to God, and he says, God of heaven, bring down this so that they know that you are God. And fire came from heaven, not only burned up the offering, burned up the water, licked up all the water, and it vaporized the rock and all the soil around this altar. And this is when the people responded. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. And the story goes on to tell us that these prophets were executed, and these false prophets were executed, and the people turned back to God at this point. Later on in the story, we see that the rain did come, that Jezebel, who was the wicked queen, wife of Ahab, was killed, and the end of this passage in James tells us that if anyone wanders from the truth, look what the children of Israel did. They were really wandering. And someone turns him back. We have Elijah here, turning back the children. Let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his ways will save a soul. All of these individuals there, we don't have a number, but all of these individuals there at this point are saved. They save their souls, and the path that they're on and all of the exponential amount of sin that would happen was halted. And they were able to save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. And so the multitude of sins here are the sins that have not been committed, because we have been able to turn back the person from the ways and the path that they were on. So I want to encourage you today, remember the power of prayer. Remember the type of faith that Elijah had. And if we pray like Elijah did, in the sense of he prayed to God knowing that what was going to happen, that God will do what he said he was going to do. We pray like that. We focus on the problems and the troubles and the situations of our loved ones, of our brothers and sisters. We're able to turn people back from their sin and cover a multitude of sins. As always, go lift someone up.